representa. Nobody has ever said that word like that in their lives. Until me! Hey guys, it's Amy here, back again with another video. Studying representation through the stories that I read, you tend to notice a few tropes in these things. Among these, I have noticed different stages of how minorities are represented. There's probably been a bunch of scholarly type stuff about this, with proper terms, but I'm gonna be talking about it from my perspective and my terms, because I did actually study a couple papers on this while doing my degree, so I guess that makes me a reliable scholarly resource. This is because the way that people end up being represented in these stories say a lot about the authors and the creators behind it. We're gonna dive into these things today, but first, hit that subscribe button and ring that bell. I post new videos every weekend on books, writing, and digital content for authors. If you want to hear more rants about my thoughts on books, writing, and the like, then you should head on over to my TikTok account. It's Amy Writer Rose. I post TikToks up there up to 5 times a week, though it has been a little bit neglected lately because my life got busy, but I'm gonna be bringing it back. Now let's go into these. We're gonna be going term by term. This is where minorities are not featured in leading roles. Typically, they are used to create up crowds or background characters. You are likely to see this a bit more with racial minorities, but Disney has been making some attempts to include some same-sex relationships in this light, which has not been in a good way. I find this to be bad nowadays because it barely represents the letter B in bare minimum. It's a red light if your main cast is all white and all straight and cisgender, but your filler characters are not. It's the same old Hollywood story about how minorities are treated. You'll lose more points if they're the only ones who die. I mean, come on! This isn't 1890. Moving on to coding. This is where a character may not necessarily be of this particular minority, but the way that they act codes towards that particular thing. It's most commonly done with queer coding in human characters or animal characters acting in stereotypical ways of a certain race or culture. I know that sometimes in queer baiting this is done because the actual companies and producers who are making these films out into the world, they are not particularly friendly towards this kind of stuff, Disney, but racial coding animals. Isn't that a bit weird? Siamese cats acting like Asians? Or fish acting black? They had a crab who was acting Jamaican and bringing on a bunch of Jamaican stereotypes. In some cases though, coding can be borderline acceptable and make sense in some cases, especially when the higher-ups won't allow representation of these certain people, and also remove stereotypes that are normally stuck on minorities. But we are so culturally bound to some of these tropes and how they are represented with these minorities that we just see the coding there anyway and then make those assumptions. I think coding is the best form of representation that shows how tight within this system we are. But if you didn't think there was a lower than that, oh, have I got something for you. So, there is a character in there who is of a minority. In this case, it is typically racial. But you don't see them being portrayed in the movie or the TV show by somebody of that minority. You know it, you hate it. It's the blackface and the cis person playing somebody trans. Why bother telling a story that includes the minority without actually including the minority? It's like hating on the name of that minority. The experience of these minorities literally cannot be universal. Like, I know a lot about Indian culture in the context of it being placed in a Western society, simply because a bunch of my friends growing up and even now are Indians. And they are Indians of varying degrees towards their upbringing in New Zealand. That doesn't mean that I know their cultures, experiences, and struggles inside and out, because I am a white girl raised in a white family. I am a secondary source of information on Indian cultures. Yes, with a plural, because each of them have different cultural things within the context of being Indian. Being Sikh, being Hindu, being a Christian Indian, being a North Indian, a South Indian, a Fijian Indian. So it could really blunder a portrayal of a minority if someone who may know about it but not experience it toys with it in any form. Washing. Most commonly experienced when a tale is adapted. This is where the minority identity of a character is pushed aside to retell the story through a straight white lens. Way to rewrite the story, guys. This is the worst way to write a minority character. To not write them at all. You are the worst human of the year. A bigger insult than not including them in the story in the first place. And wouldn't this also be a lot of hard work? You'd basically have to rewrite so much of the story and about the way that the character behaves, for example, because being a minority can have a bunch of impact on a person's psyche, as is the same with not being a minority. Someone who has a minority may be a bit more humble and willing to fight, but then someone who doesn't come from a certain minority, they will have privileges that will be invisible to them, and maybe some slight sort of arrogance. And an example about how this kind of stuff can change, even if someone is an ally, there's always going to be biases and stuff. If they're a minority, make them a minority when you adapt, please. Tokenism is often considered the bare minimum nowadays, where the cast will include one person of color and one queer person within the main group. You mainly get this form of tokenism in a trio of characters or a group of 4. One is female, one is a person of color, maybe one of them is queer, and if you're really lucky, one of them is also disabled. And yet the leader of this trio is usually the straight white cis man, and every person in this group has only one of these minorities. I do not always see this as the bare minimum like others do. I see this more as people doing this so that people don't get upset. An executive decision, if you will. One executive decision that will prevent news articles coming up, slandering their name. I mean, this was the bare minimum like 20 years ago. Times have changed, and so have the ways that we accept people. Because of my education and the way that I was brought up, in my writing, I include more characters that are minorities than characters that are not. Of course, these minorities are within varying degrees. But even so, if there's only one person of a particular minority group present in the main cast, that's a bit of a red flag for me. Because it's not obvious that they are genuine about representing these people. They're just keeping people tame enough to not slaughter their name. Comic relief, but I'm not talking about this in a general comic relief sense. This is where a minority character is included, but they are usually the best friend of the main character, and there to offer comic relief. Quite often their comic relief revolves around stereotypes about what makes them a minority. Gay men being more feminine than straight females, overly uneducated black people, women comically proving their superiority to men. Where this can get really bad is if nothing else is added to this character. Minorities and what makes people minorities are not something to be made jokes about. A big flag for me is also when this is included within coding. American sitcoms in the 2000s were especially guilty of this, where they would have a character's comedic value hinge on them doing stereotypically gay things while being totally straight. Are the gays a joke to you? Minorities did not come this far to gain rights and recognition, and continue to do so, mind you, to have their image be something to laugh at. This is a very typical way for someone of a minority to be represented as the main character. Going into a story that is a social commentary surrounding their struggles about what makes them a minority. Females dealing with the patriarchy, homosexuals dealing with coming out, people of color dealing with racism. While these are important stories to tell, what I don't like about these stories is how they become the only stories that can be told about these people, especially to mass media. Not everybody wants to be defined by what makes them a minority. There's more to people than that. I am not saying to stop telling these stories, but I don't want stories about being minorities to be the only stories they can have. Besides, when this is done too much, the messages that they spread get really in your face, kind of obvious. Signposts everywhere, especially when it comes to Disney and their feminism. Similar to social commentaries, this takes on a different stride. This is where a beloved story is retold through a minority lens. Quite often, fairy tales or classical literature take on this form, through retellings. A feminist Cinderella or Snow White would probably be the one that's the most milked to death. But what does this tell you in terms of representation? This is a message to directly show that a minority can have the same stories that the privileged have. A lot of people don't think this is something that should matter, most of those being bigots who think that retellings equal thievery of European culture. But it's not. These stories are just so popular and sissified that everybody else needs to have their turns as well. It becomes a familiar ground for subversions, which in this case is to subvert who gets to tell the story. That is crucial in today's society. These kinds of stories often look into the life and culture of a minority, where most of the characters come from this said minority. This is usually done as a way to get Western audiences to know about the inner working of cultures. We're talking Crazy Rich Asians, Black Panther, In the Heights, and more. I feel like this kind of stuff is an attempt to showcase what it's like to live as a minority within those contexts. More so, these internal struggles characters may be facing when it comes to being like that as a group. Expectations on being successful from cultural standpoints and such. This gives a chance for Western societies to look into these things and understand what it may be like for these guys. These are great, but the bigger issue is when people look at these and assume this is the life of everyone in that particular culture. This is the kind of representation that I am drawn to the most, and I think is the kind of representation that a lot of people should be striving for when they're not writing about social commentaries, inner looks, or retellings. We don't ignore the minorities of a person, but we don't let it define their character either. It's not a story about them being a minority. It's about how they are within the story itself. This is the kind of representation I like to do in my stories, where anyone of any walk of life is represented, but it doesn't define who they are. And we need to be able to show that. I'm not saying that stories without backgrounds related to minorities should be eradicated. I'm just saying they're not the only stories to be told about them, because those minorities need regular stories about them just as much. And there we go. Those are my takes on how minorities are represented. If I've missed any, then please let me know in the comments and we can do some more discussion about this, because I love this kind of stuff. Without further ado, like this video and subscribe if you're new around here. You can ring that bell to find out when I post more creative content. ASTER'S CODA Exposure, my novel, it's got a fair amount of representation in there. We got a bisexual lead, we've got some Pacific Islander representation, we've got a bunch of others that I'm forgetting. Read to find out for yourself. And you can also check down in the description for my Instagram, my TikTok, my Fiverr, and my website. Stay creative, everybody, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.